October 24th, 1944. Commander David McCampbell squeezes the trigger. 650 caliber machine guns erupt. Tracers tear through the Pacific sky like burning arrows. A Japanese Zero catches fire, explodes into a fireball, and spirals toward the ocean below. McCampbell doesn't watch it fall. He's already pulling back on the stick, hunting his next victim. In the next 90 minutes, this 34-year-old pilot will shoot down 9 enemy aircraft in a single sortie. He will face 60 Japanese warplanes with only one wingman by his side. He will land with exactly 1 gallon of fuel left in his tank, and 2 bullets remaining in his guns. This is not a movie. This is not an exaggeration. This is the greatest aerial combat achievement in American naval history. And it happened because one man refused to run when every logical calculation said he should. Here's the thing about October 1944. The Pacific War has reached its most violent, most desperate, most critical moment. 3 years after Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy is finally closing the noose around Imperial Japan. General Douglas MacArthur has just waded ashore at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines. He's made good on his famous promise. He has returned. But the Japanese Empire is not dead yet, not by a long shot. They have launched Operation Shogo 1, their last desperate gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet. The stakes are total. If the Japanese succeed, tens of thousands of American Marines on the beaches of Leyte will be cut off from supplies, from reinforcements, from hope. They will be slaughtered. The entire Pacific campaign hangs in the balance. This is not hyperbole. Military historians agree that Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in human history. 4 separate engagements spanning 100,000 square miles of ocean, nearly 300 ships, thousands of aircraft. And in the middle of this chaos, the USS Essex is about to face a nightmare. The ship's radar scope lights up with a massive formation of enemy aircraft, 70 miles away. Inbound, 3 waves, 60 planes, bombers, fighters, all of them heading straight for the American fleet. The Essex has a problem, a big problem. Every available fighter has already been launched to intercept strikes elsewhere. The flight deck is empty. The reserves are gone. There are exactly 7 fighters left that can scramble. 7 against 60. And it's about to get worse. But every great story needs a hero. And this hero wasn't born in a fighter cockpit. David McCampbell came from Bessemer, Alabama, a small town. A simple beginning. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1933, right in the middle of the Great Depression. And here's where the story takes its first twist. The Navy actually kicked him out. Budget cuts. They said his eyesight wasn't good enough. Can you imagine? The man who would become America's greatest naval ace, rejected because someone thought his eyes weren't sharp enough. Most men would have accepted that verdict. Most men would have moved on with their lives, found a different career, a different dream. McCampbell fought his way back in. He clawed his way back into naval aviation. But he didn't get to fly fighters immediately. No, the Navy made him a landing signal officer, an LSO. His job was to stand on the deck of aircraft carriers, waving paddles, guiding other pilots safely onto the ship. He watched men crash. He watched friends die. He learned something that would save his life years later. Patience. Discipline. The understanding that in aerial combat, the man who keeps his head wins. The man who panics dies. By 1944, McCampbell was 34 years old. In fighter pilot terms, that's ancient. Most combat pilots are in their early 20s. Young, aggressive, full of fire and invincibility. McCampbell was different. He was the Commander Air Group, the CAG, of Air Group 15, the fabled 15. His job was to manage the air wing, coordinate strikes, handle administration. He wasn't supposed to be flying combat missions. He was supposed to be directing them from the ready room. But on the morning of October 24th, 1944, there was no one else. The radar showed 60 enemy aircraft. 7 Hellcats scrambled from the Essex. And then, everything fell apart. 5 of those 7 fighters had to turn back. Mechanical problems, engine trouble, low fuel. They dropped out of the formation one by one, limping back to the carrier. Suddenly, the sky was very, very empty. 2 American fighters remained, Commander David McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing. 2 planes against 60. The math was suicide. The smart move, the logical move, the move that every tactical manual would recommend, was to dive away, run for the fleet, call for reinforcements, live to fight another day. McCampbell looked at his instrument panel. He checked his fuel gauge. Not even a full load. They'd rushed him off the deck so fast, there wasn't time to top off the tanks. He checked his guns. 650 caliber machine guns. 2,400 rounds of ammunition. He looked across at Rushing's Hellcat. The young ensign was waiting for orders. McCampbell could have ordered a retreat. No one would have blamed him. Instead, he keyed his radio. "We're going hunting." That decision, made in a fraction of a second, would change the course of the air battle over Leyte Gulf. The Japanese formation had no idea what was about to hit them. They saw 2 American planes climbing toward them. 2 against 60. The Japanese pilots probably laughed. This was going to be easy. Now let me explain why McCampbell's strategy was genius. Because he didn't just charge into that swarm of enemy fighters like some kind of Hollywood hero looking for a glorious death. He did something far more intelligent. Far more deadly. He understood the fundamental difference between his aircraft and theirs. The Japanese were flying A6M0s, Nakajima Ki 43 Oscars, and Kawasaki Ki 61 Tonys. The Zero, especially, was legendary. It could turn on a dime. It was nimble, agile, a dancer in the sky. If McCampbell tried to dogfight them turn for turn, he would lose. Period. But the Grumman F6F Hellcat had different advantages. It was heavier, yes. Less maneuverable, absolutely. But it was fast. It could dive like a meteor. It could climb like a homesick angel. And most importantly, it was built like a tank. The Hellcat could take punishment that would tear a Zero apart. McCampbell made a decision that would be studied in war colleges for generations. He climbed. He took his Hellcat up to 25,000 feet, positioning himself above the Japanese formation. He used the sun to hide his silhouette, and then he watched. The Japanese formation was undisciplined. They were weaving, confident in their overwhelming numbers. They weren't expecting a fight. They were expecting a turkey shoot. McCampbell keyed his radio to Rushing. "We're going to work on the stragglers. Pick off the weak ones. Stay together, and don't let them box us in." The first dive was textbook perfection. McCampbell pushed the stick forward. The Hellcat screamed down from altitude, reaching speeds over 400 miles per hour. The airframe shuddered under the G-forces. He lined up on a Zero flying on the outer edge of the formation. 800 yards. Too far. 600 yards. Getting closer. 400 yards. Perfect. He squeezed the trigger. The 50 caliber machine guns erupted. Tracers poured out like a stream of fire. The Zero, unarmored and fragile, never had a chance. It caught fire instantly. It exploded. McCampbell didn't watch it fall. He was already pulling back on the stick, using his incredible speed to rocket back up into the sky. The Japanese couldn't catch him. By the time they realized what had happened, he was already thousands of feet above them, setting up for another attack. This was boom and zoom fighting at its finest. Dive, fire, climb, repeat. The Japanese tried to chase him. They pulled their noses up, clawing for altitude, trying to catch the American. But the Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney engine was more powerful. McCampbell climbed faster than they could follow. The Japanese plane stalled out, hanging motionless in the air for a split second before falling back. In that moment of helplessness, McCampbell or Rushing would dive again. Another burst of fire. Another kill. The rhythm became almost mechanical. Dive, fire, climb, hunt for the next straggler. For 90 minutes, 2 American pilots terrorized a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft. McCampbell was shooting with surgical precision. He didn't spray bullets wildly like some panicked rookie. He fired in short, controlled bursts. 1 second, 2 seconds. Just enough to destroy his target. Just enough to conserve ammunition for the next kill. 3, 4, 5 enemy planes fell from the sky. McCampbell was now an ace in a single mission. Most pilots go their entire careers without shooting down 5 aircraft. McCampbell did it before lunch. But he wasn't done. 6, 7. By now, the Japanese formation was in complete disarray. The bombers had jettisoned their weapons into the ocean just to gain speed. McCampbell had achieved his primary objective. The American fleet was safe. The attack had been broken. But there were still targets in the sky, and McCampbell still had ammunition. 8. His guns were running dry now. 3 of his 6 machine guns had jammed or run empty. The uneven recoil from the remaining guns threw his plane sideways with every burst. He had to wrestle the stick just to keep his sights on target. He found one more straggler, a lone Japanese fighter trying to dive away toward the clouds over Luzon. McCampbell chased him down. He anticipated the enemy pilot's turn. He fired a final burst. 9. 9 confirmed kills in a single sortie, a record that has never been broken by an American pilot. Rushing had shot down 6 of his own. Together, 2 men had destroyed 15 enemy aircraft. 15. And then the silence came. The sky was empty. The surviving Japanese had scattered, fleeing toward their bases on Luzon. McCampbell looked at his fuel gauge. Empty. Actually, worse than empty. The needle was bouncing on 0. He was over 100 miles from the Essex, deep in enemy territory. If his engine quit now, he would ditch in the ocean. If he was lucky, he would drown. If he was unlucky, the Japanese would capture him. And the Japanese were not known for mercy toward downed pilots. McCampbell keyed his radio. "Let's go home. Lean it out." He and Rushing reduced their engine power to almost nothing. They leaned the fuel mixture until their engines were barely running, sipping the last drops of gasoline. They glided more than they flew. Every minute, McCampbell expected the engine to cough and die. The flight back was the longest of his life. Finally, the American fleet appeared on the horizon. Gray specks on a blue ocean. Beautiful, beautiful gray specks. McCampbell called the tower. "Consort 1 inbound. Dry. I repeat, DRY." The Essex cleared the deck. McCampbell lowered his landing gear, praying the hydraulics still worked. They did. He lined up his approach. One chance. He couldn't go around. There was no fuel for a second pass. The landing signal officer waved him in. "Cut throttle." The Hellcat dropped onto the deck. The tailhook caught the arresting wire. The plane jerked to a stop, and then the engine died. Not because McCampbell cut the ignition, because the fuel tank was empty. When the deck crew measured later, they found exactly 1 gallon remaining, enough for maybe 30 seconds of flight. But here's the detail that still gives me chills. The ordnance crews rushed to McCampbell's plane, expecting to patch bullet holes. Every fighter that comes back from combat has damage. It's inevitable. They walked around the Hellcat, examining every inch. They found nothing. Not a single bullet hole. Not one. McCampbell had fought 60 enemy aircraft for 90 minutes and never been touched. Then they opened the gun bays. The Hellcat carries 2,400 rounds of ammunition. McCampbell had 2 rounds left. 2 bullets. He had used 2,398 rounds to destroy 9 enemy aircraft. He had been precise down to the final trigger squeeze. McCampbell climbed out of the cockpit, stiff, exhausted, his face covered in soot from the gun gases. Rushing landed right behind him. The young ensign was grinning from ear to ear. "We had a field day, CAG." McCampbell just nodded. He was too tired for celebration. He walked to the ready room where the intelligence officers waited. They didn't believe him at first. 9 planes? In one mission? Impossible. But the gun camera footage told the truth. Frame by frame, it showed Japanese aircraft exploding, disintegrating, spiraling into the ocean. It showed the calm, methodical precision of a master at work. News of the mission of October 24th spread through the fleet like wildfire. Morale soared at a critical moment in the battle. David McCampbell was recommended for the Medal of Honor. The citation would read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty, Commander McCampbell, assisted by but 1 plane, intercepted and daringly attacked a formation of 60 hostile land-based craft." President Roosevelt himself received the report. McCampbell finished the war with 34 confirmed aerial victories, the highest score of any American Navy pilot in history. The ace of aces. He survived the war. He didn't write books or seek fame. He stayed in the Navy, retiring as a captain in 1964. He passed away in 1996 in Florida. But his legacy lives on. Every time someone studies aerial combat, every time a young pilot learns about fighter tactics, they hear the name McCampbell. They learn about the day when 60-2 meant nothing, because 1 man refused to run. But here's what the history books don't tell you. McCampbell's victory on October 24th was just the beginning. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was far from over. Larger threats were gathering. The Japanese had not played their final card. In Part 2, we will see what happened when the greatest naval battle in history reached its terrifying climax. We will witness the moment when American sailors faced a nightmare they never expected. When massive Japanese battleships appeared on the horizon where no battleships should have been. When the thin line between victory and catastrophe became measured in minutes, not hours. McCampbell had won the sky. But could anyone hold the sea? In Part 1, you witnessed something impossible. Commander David McCampbell and his wingman faced 60 Japanese aircraft with nothing but 2 Hellcats and 2,400 rounds of ammunition. They shot down 15 enemy planes. They landed with 1 gallon of fuel and 2 bullets remaining. The American fleet was saved. The sky belonged to McCampbell. But here's what I didn't tell you. While McCampbell was hunting Zeros above the Philippine Sea, a far more terrifying threat was approaching from the west. A threat that would make 60 aircraft look like a minor inconvenience. Because on the morning of October 25, 1944, just hours after McCampbell's victory, American sailors would face the most powerful surface fleet Japan had ever assembled. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all of them heading straight for the vulnerable American escort carriers. And standing between those carriers and total annihilation was a force so small, so outgunned, so completely doomed that what happened next would become the most celebrated last stand in naval history. This is the Battle off Samar. And this is where ordinary men became legends. Let me set the scene. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was actually 4 separate engagements happening simultaneously across hundreds of miles of ocean. Admiral William Halsey commanded the powerful Third Fleet, the fast carriers and battleships that represented America's main striking force. His job was to protect the invasion beaches from any Japanese naval attack. But the Japanese had a plan, a brilliant, desperate, suicidal plan. They would use their remaining aircraft carriers as bait, empty carriers with almost no planes, sailing north to draw Halsey away from the invasion fleet. And it worked. Halsey took the bait. He saw Japanese carriers on his radar, and he couldn't resist. He took his entire Third Fleet north, chasing what he thought was the main enemy force. He left the invasion beaches completely unprotected. Well, not completely. There was Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was a unit of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Escort carriers weren't real carriers. They were converted merchant ships with flight decks welded on top. Sailors called them Kaiser coffins or jeep carriers. They were slow. They were unarmored. They carried aircraft meant for ground support, not naval combat. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were even worse off. These were small ships designed to hunt submarines, not fight surface battles. Their largest guns were 5-inch cannons. The Japanese battleships approaching them had 18-inch guns. Let me put that in perspective. An 18-inch shell weighs as much as a small car. A 5-inch shell weighs about 50 pounds. Taffy 3 was a mosquito facing a sledgehammer. The morning of October 25, 1944, began quietly. The escort carriers of Taffy 3 were launching routine patrols, supporting the ground troops on Leyte. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague commanded the unit from his flagship, the USS Fanshawe Bay. At 0645, one of his pilots reported something strange. Ships on the horizon. Pagoda masts. Sprague didn't believe it at first. There shouldn't be any Japanese ships in that area. Halsey's fleet was supposed to be blocking the San Bernardino Strait. But Halsey wasn't there. Halsey was 300 miles north, chasing empty carriers. The ships on the horizon were Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. 23 warships in total, representing more firepower than most nations possessed. They had slipped through the unguarded strait during the night, and now they were 17 miles away from Taffy 3, closing fast. Sprague's reaction was immediate and understandable. He broadcast a plain language distress call that would become famous. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of your task group and closing at 30 knots. Then he ordered his ships to run. But here's the thing about escort carriers. They can only make 18 knots. The Japanese cruisers could make 35. Running was merely delaying the inevitable. Within minutes, massive geysers of water began erupting around the American ships. The Japanese were firing. Those first salvos fell short, but they were finding the range. Sprague ordered his carriers to launch everything they had. Every aircraft, armed or not, fueled or not, get them in the air. Some planes took off with bombs. Some took off with depth charges meant for submarines. Some took off with nothing but machine gun ammunition. It didn't matter. Anything to slow down the Japanese. And then Sprague made a decision that defined the battle. He ordered his destroyers to attack. Think about this for a moment. He ordered 3 destroyers, the USS Johnston, USS Hull, and USS Heermann, to charge directly at the Japanese battle line. These ships displaced about 2,000 tons each. The Yamato displaced 72,000 tons. This was David versus Goliath, except Goliath had 22 friends. The USS Johnston was commanded by Commander Ernest E. Evans. Evans was a Cherokee from Oklahoma, a man who had told his crew when he took command that this ship would be an aggressive ship. He meant it. When Sprague's order came, Evans didn't wait for the other destroyers to form up. He simply turned his ship toward the enemy and charged. Full speed. Alone. The Johnston raced toward the Japanese cruiser line, her 5-inch guns blazing. At 10,000 yards, Evans launched a full spread of 10 torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano. 1 torpedo hit. The Kumano's bow was blown off. She fell out of formation, out of the battle. First blood to the Americans. But the Japanese response was devastating. The Johnston was hit by 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo and 3 6-inch shells from a cruiser. In an instant, the ship lost her engine power, her steering, and most of her firepower. Evans was wounded, his shirt blown off, 2 fingers on his left hand missing. He wrapped a handkerchief around the wound and kept fighting. He conned his crippled ship from the fantail, shouting orders through a chain of sailors passing messages by voice. Meanwhile, the USS Hull and USS Heermann had joined the attack. The Hull charged straight at the battleship line. Commander Leon Kintberger knew it was suicide. He did it anyway. The Hull fired her torpedoes at the Yamato. She didn't hit, but she forced the massive battleship to turn away, to break off her pursuit of the carriers. Every minute the battleships weren't shooting at carriers was a minute those carriers survived. The Hull absorbed over 40 hits. 40. Her crew kept fighting until the ship capsized and sank. Of her crew of 339 men, 253 died. The Heermann somehow survived the charge. She weaved through shell splashes, launched her torpedoes, and kept the Japanese cruisers confused and distracted. Her captain, Commander Amos T. Hathaway, would later say he navigated by watching where the last shells landed and steering away from the pattern. Pure instinct. Pure luck. Pure insanity. But the destroyers weren't fighting alone. The destroyer escorts joined the attack. These were even smaller ships than the destroyers, with even less firepower. The USS Samuel B. Roberts was one of them. Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland addressed his crew over the intercom before the battle. His words became legend. "We're making a torpedo run. The odds are against us, but we're going in. Gentlemen, we are going to fight our way out." The Samuel B. Roberts charged into point-blank range of the Japanese cruisers. So close that her 5-inch guns were actually effective. So close that the Japanese couldn't depress their massive guns low enough to hit her. For over an hour, this tiny ship dueled with heavy cruisers. She fired over 600 5-inch shells. Her guns became so hot that the crews had to use fire hoses to cool them. Eventually, the Japanese found the range. The Samuel B. Roberts was hit repeatedly. She sank with her guns still firing. The Japanese sailors watching from their cruisers were stunned. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. These tiny American ships were attacking them. And above it all, the aircraft from Taffy 3 were doing their part. They had no armor-piercing bombs. They had no torpedoes. Some had nothing but machine guns. It didn't matter. They attacked anyway. Pilots made dry runs, diving at Japanese ships with empty bomb racks, just to distract the gunners. They strafed the bridges of battleships with 50-caliber rounds that couldn't possibly penetrate the armor. They dropped depth charges on cruisers. They did everything and anything to buy time for the carriers. Lieutenant Paul Garrison flew his Avenger torpedo bomber at the Japanese cruiser Chokai. He dropped his single bomb and hit her squarely on the stern. The explosion ignited the cruiser's torpedoes. She blew apart and sank. One aircraft, one bomb, one cruiser killed. The Japanese couldn't understand it. They were winning. They had sunk American ships. They were closing on the carriers. But the Americans would not stop attacking. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was magnificent. For over 2 hours, the battle raged. The Japanese sank the USS Johnston, the USS Hoel, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, and the escort carrier USS Gambier Bay. They damaged almost every other ship in Taffy 3, but they paid a price. The cruiser Kumano was crippled. The cruiser Chokai was sunk. The cruiser Chikuma was sunk. The cruiser Suzuya was so damaged she had to be scuttled. And then something extraordinary happened. At 0920, Admiral Kurita ordered his fleet to break off the attack. He turned around. He retreated. The most powerful surface force in the Pacific Ocean ran away from 6 escort carriers and a handful of destroyers. Why? Kurita never fully explained his decision. He was exhausted. He had been under constant air attack for days. His communications were in chaos. He thought he was facing a much larger force than he actually was. The ferocity of the American defense convinced him that he must be fighting fleet carriers and heavy cruisers, not escort carriers and destroyer escorts. The sheer aggression of the American attacks broke his will to fight. The battle off Samar was over. Taffy 3 had lost 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and 1 escort carrier. Over 1,500 American sailors died. But they had stopped a force that should have annihilated them. They had saved the invasion fleet. They had saved the Marines on the beaches of Leyte. Commander Ernest Evans went down with his ship. Survivors in the water saw him on the deck of the sinking Johnston, still giving orders. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously. He was the first Native American to receive the Navy's highest honor in World War II. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of the Samuel B. Roberts survived. He spent 50 hours in shark-infested waters before rescue. He received the Navy Cross. The entire crew of the Johnston and the Samuel B. Roberts received the Presidential Unit Citation. Their sacrifice would be remembered as the finest example of naval courage in American history. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. While Taffy 3 was fighting for its life, while destroyers were charging battleships, while pilots were making dry runs with empty bomb racks, Admiral Halsey was still 300 miles to the north. He had been chasing empty carriers. When he received Sprague's distress call, he couldn't believe it. The Japanese had played him perfectly. He turned his fleet around and raced south, but he was too late. By the time he arrived, the battle was over. Kurita had retreated. Taffy 3 had won alone. Halsey would spend the rest of his life defending his decision to chase the Northern force. The controversy would never fully die. But here's the truth. The battle off Samar was won by the men who fought it, not by the admirals who commanded from a distance. It was won by destroyer captains who charged battleships, by pilots who attacked with empty guns, by sailors who kept fighting when their ships were sinking beneath them. David McCampbell proved that skill and discipline could overcome impossible odds in the air. The men of Taffy III proved the same thing on the sea. But the Battle of Leyte Gulf was not yet over. The Japanese had one more card to play. A card that would change naval warfare forever. A card so terrifying that American sailors would speak of it in whispers for years to come. In Part 3, we will witness the birth of the most feared weapon of the Pacific War. We will see the moment when Japanese pilots stopped trying to bomb American ships and started trying to become the bombs themselves. The kamikaze era was about to begin, and no one was ready for what was coming. Let me remind you where we've been. In Part 1, Commander David McCampbell shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in a single sortie, facing 60 enemy planes with just one wingman. In Part 2, the destroyers and escort carriers of Taffy III charged Japanese battleships in the most heroic last stand in naval history. Admiral Kurita's massive fleet retreated from ships a fraction of their size. The American pilots and sailors had proven that skill, courage, and sheer aggression could overcome impossible odds. But the Japanese learned something from those defeats. They learned that conventional attacks weren't working anymore. American pilots were too skilled. American ships were too well defended. American technology was advancing too fast. So the Japanese High Command made a decision that would change warfare forever. If their pilots couldn't survive long enough to drop bombs accurately, then their pilots would become the bombs. October 25th, 1944. The same day Taffy III was fighting for survival off Samar. That was the day the first organized kamikaze attacks began, and the Pacific War entered its most terrifying chapter. The word kamikaze means divine wind. It refers to typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, saving Japan from conquest. The Japanese military believed they needed another divine wind to save their empire from American invasion. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi was the architect of this nightmare. He arrived in the Philippines on October 17, 1944, to take command of the First Air Fleet. What he found horrified him. The Japanese naval air forces were devastated. They had lost most of their experienced pilots. The new recruits had barely enough training to take off and land. They certainly couldn't dogfight American Hellcats. They couldn't hit maneuvering ships with conventional bombs. Onishi looked at his pilots. Boys, really. Some were 19 years old. Some had less than 100 hours of flight time. Against them were American aces like McCampbell, men with thousands of hours and dozens of kills. The math was brutal. A conventionally trained Japanese pilot had maybe a 5% chance of scoring a hit on an American ship before being shot down. A kamikaze pilot had a much higher chance. He didn't need to survive. He didn't need to pull out of his dive. He just needed to aim and hold steady until impact. Onishi calculated that kamikaze tactics could increase hit rates to 25% or higher. 1 in 4 pilots would damage or destroy an American ship. The trade was simple and horrifying. 1 Japanese pilot, 1 Japanese plane, 1 American ship. Onishi gathered his pilots on October 19th. He asked for volunteers. Every hand went up. The first official kamikaze unit was called the Shimpu Special Attack Unit. Shimpu is another reading of the characters for kamikaze. They flew their first missions on October 25th, targeting the escort carriers of Taffy III and the other Taffy units. 5 Zeros, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, dove on the USS Santee. 1 hit. The bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar. Fires broke out. The ship survived, but just barely. Another Zero dove on the USS Sewanee. Direct hit. Fires. Explosions. The ship survived. Then the kamikazes found the USS St. Lo, one of the escort carriers that had just survived the battle off Samar. A single Zero dove from the clouds. The anti-aircraft guns blazed. Tracers filled the sky. The Zero kept coming. It crashed into the flight deck. The bomb penetrated the hangar and exploded among armed aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped the ship apart. The USS St. Lo sank in 30 minutes. She was the first major warship sunk by a kamikaze attack. She would not be the last. The statistics were terrifying. In just 3 days of organized kamikaze operations during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese suicide planes sank 1 escort carrier, damaged 6 more, and damaged numerous other vessels. The conventional Japanese air attacks during the same period achieved almost nothing. The message was clear. Kamikazes worked. But here's what the Japanese commanders didn't anticipate. They expected the American Navy to collapse psychologically. They expected American sailors to break under the pressure of facing an enemy who couldn't be deterred, couldn't be scared, couldn't be stopped by anything except destruction. They were wrong. The American response wasn't panic. It was adaptation. The U.S. Navy began redesigning its entire defensive doctrine. Radar picket ships were pushed further out to provide earlier warning. Combat air patrols were expanded and repositioned. Anti-aircraft guns were increased on every ship that could carry them. The 5-inch guns were given proximity fuses, shells that exploded near aircraft without needing a direct hit. The 40mm Bofors cannons became the primary close-range defense. Ships began carrying so many anti-aircraft guns that they could put up literal walls of steel in the sky. And the tactics changed. American ships learned to maneuver radically when kamikazes approached. They learned to concentrate fire. They learned that shooting down a kamikaze early was good, but shooting one down at the last second was often too late. Even a destroyed aircraft could crash into a ship on momentum alone. The dead pilot didn't need to aim anymore. Gravity would do the work. The kamikazes reached their peak at Okinawa in April 1945. Operation Kikusui, Floating Chrysanthemums, launched nearly 1,900 suicide aircraft at the American fleet over 3 months. The results were devastating for both sides. American ships were hit again and again. The destroyer USS Lutza was crashed by a kamikaze and nearly sank. The USS Bush took 4 kamikaze hits and went down. The USS Callahan was hit and sunk. The USS Manard L. Able became the first ship sunk by an Oka, a piloted flying bomb carried under a bomber and released near the target. The Oka was called Baka by the Americans. Baka means fool in Japanese. But there was nothing foolish about being killed by one. In total, kamikaze attacks sank 34 American ships during the Pacific War. They damaged 368 more. They killed approximately 4,900 American sailors and wounded another 4,800. These numbers made kamikazes the most effective weapon the Japanese employed after 1944. But the Americans were learning, and the American response was becoming deadly. The combat air patrols over Okinawa became killing fields for Japanese aircraft. American pilots were shooting down kamikazes at unprecedented rates. The Hellcat and Corsair pilots had learned to intercept the attackers far from the fleet. They had learned to target the bombers carrying Oka rockets. They had learned to follow damaged kamikazes all the way down to ensure they couldn't recover and resume their attack. The radar picket destroyers were suffering horrible losses, but they were doing their job. They were giving the fleet those precious extra minutes of warning. Commander Frederick Julian Becton of the USS Laffey became a legend at Okinawa. On April 16, 1945, his destroyer was attacked by 22 kamikazes over 80 minutes. 22 separate suicide aircraft dove on his single ship. The Laffey was hit by 6 kamikazes and 4 bombs. Her guns shot down 9 attackers. She refused to sink. She made it back to port under her own power. Becton received the Navy Cross. The Laffey received the nickname, the ship that would not die. Stories like the Laffey spread through the fleet. They became proof that kamikazes could be defeated, could be survived. The psychological weapon was losing its edge. The final statistics tell the real story. Approximately 3,800 Japanese pilots died in kamikaze attacks. They sank 34 ships and damaged 368. That's roughly 1 ship sunk for every 112 pilots. 1 ship damaged for every 10 pilots. From the Japanese perspective, this was success. From any rational military perspective, it was unsustainable. The Japanese were trading trained pilots, irreplaceable aircraft, and aviation fuel for damage that the American industrial machine could repair in weeks. The Americans were building ships faster than kamikazes could sink them. The kamikazes killed thousands of Americans, but they never came close to stopping the American advance. They never sank a fleet carrier. They never turned the tide of a single battle. They delayed nothing. They changed nothing, except the nature of the horror. And here's the detail that haunts historians. The kamikaze pilots weren't fanatics in the way we imagine. Many of their letters home have survived. They wrote about fear. They wrote about doubt. They wrote about their love for their families and their hope for Japan's future. They were young men, most of them, who had been told that their deaths were the only way to save their country. Some believed it. Some didn't. All of them climbed into their cockpits anyway. A pilot named Isao Matsuo wrote his last letter the night before his mission. He was 23 years old. He wrote that he wasn't dying for the emperor or for glory. He was dying because he hoped his sacrifice might protect his little sister from the American invasion. He flew into an American ship the next morning. The war ended 4 months later. His sister survived. We don't know if she ever knew about his letter. Commander David McCampbell never faced a kamikaze attack directly. His tour ended before the suicide campaign reached its peak. But the men he led, the pilots of Air Group 15, were on the front lines of the kamikaze defense. They flew combat air patrol after combat air patrol, intercepting Japanese aircraft before they could reach the fleet. The skills McCampbell had taught them, the discipline, the boom and zoom tactics, the controlled aggression. These became the tools that saved American lives at Okinawa. The war ended on August 15, 1945. Japan surrendered after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The kamikaze program ended with it. The Oka rockets were never used again. The trained suicide pilots who survived the war had to find a way to live with what they had prepared to do. But what happened to McCampbell? What happened to the men of Taffy 3? What happened to the sailors who survived the kamikazes? In Part 4, we will follow these stories to their conclusions. We will see the awards and the honors. We will see the struggles and the nightmares. We will see what happened when the greatest generation came home and tried to explain what they had seen to a country that couldn't possibly understand. and we will ask the question that matters most. What did it all mean? Why does it still matter 80 years later? The battles are over. The ships are rusted hulks or museum pieces. Most of the men who fought are gone now. But their story lives on. And that story has one final chapter. A chapter about legacy. About memory. About what we owe to the men who flew into impossible odds and sailed into certain death so that the rest of us could live in a world they made possible. That chapter begins now. Let me take you back to where this journey began, October 1944. A 34-year-old commander named David McCampbell faced 60 Japanese aircraft with one wingman and refused to run. He shot down 9 planes in 90 minutes. He landed with 1 gallon of fuel and 2 bullets remaining. In the hours that followed, the destroyers and destroyer escorts of Taffy 3 charged Japanese battleships in the most heroic last stand in naval history. And then came the kamikazes, the divine wind. Thousands of young men who turned themselves into guided missiles because conventional tactics had failed. We've witnessed incredible courage. We've seen impossible victories. We've watched ordinary men do extraordinary things. But now comes the question that haunts every war story. What happened next? What became of these men when the guns fell silent? What did their sacrifices mean in the years and decades that followed? This is the part of the story that textbooks rarely tell. This is where legends become human again. And sometimes, what happened after the war is more surprising than what happened during it. David McCampbell came home a hero. There was no question about that. His Medal of Honor citation was read by President Franklin D. Roosevelt himself. 34 confirmed aerial victories made him the Navy's Ace of Aces, a title no American naval aviator has claimed since. He had done something that seemed impossible, and the nation wanted to celebrate him. But McCampbell wasn't interested in celebration. He didn't write a memoir when he came home. He didn't go on lecture tours. He didn't become a politician or a celebrity. He stayed in the Navy. He kept flying. He kept serving. That was who David McCampbell was. A professional, a career officer who did his job and didn't seek glory for doing it. He rose through the ranks steadily, but not spectacularly. He commanded air groups. He commanded air stations. He never reached admiral. Some historians wonder why. A Medal of Honor winner, the highest-scoring Navy ace in history, and he retired as a captain in 1964. 20 years of service after the war, and he never got that final star. McCampbell never complained. He settled in Florida. He lived quietly. He attended reunions with his old pilots from Air Group 15, the men he had led into combat. They called him Dashing Dave, though he was anything but dashing. He was steady, reliable, the kind of man who did the right thing because it was right, not because anyone was watching. He died on June 30th, 1996, at the age of 86. His obituary mentioned the Medal of Honor. It mentioned the 9 kills in one mission. It didn't mention that he had spent the last 30 years of his life avoiding the spotlight, living the quiet existence of a man who had nothing left to prove. But McCampbell's legacy wasn't about medals or rank. His legacy was about what he taught. The tactics he perfected, the boom and zoom fighting style, the disciplined trigger control, the refusal to panic under pressure. These became the foundation of American naval aviation doctrine. Every fighter pilot who trained at Top Gun learned principles that McCampbell demonstrated in combat. Energy management, situational awareness, patience. The understanding that survival and victory come from outthinking your enemy, not outmaneuvering him. The F-6F Hellcat that McCampbell flew was retired after the war, replaced by jets that flew twice as fast, but the principles remained the same. American pilots in Korea flew F-9F Panthers and F-86 Sabres, using tactics McCampbell would have recognized.
American pilots in Vietnam flew F-4 Phantoms and still relied on the energy fighting doctrine that worked over the Philippine Sea. Even today, in an age of radar missiles and beyond visual range combat, the fundamentals haven't changed. Know your aircraft. Know your enemy. Stay calm. Fight smart. McCampbell taught an entire generation of pilots how to win, and they taught the next generation, and the next. The men of Taffy 3 had a different legacy. Many of them didn't survive to see it. Commander Ernest Evans of the USS Johnston went down with his ship. His body was never recovered. He received the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first Native American in the Navy to be so honored during World War II. The Johnston herself was lost for decades, her wreckage lying somewhere in the Philippine Deep. It wasn't until 2019 that an expedition led by Paul Allen's research vessel Petrel discovered her remains. She was found at a depth of over 21,000 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever located at that time. The images were haunting. Her hull was intact. Her gun turrets were still pointed toward where the enemy had been. She went down fighting, and 75 years later, she was still at her battle station. Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland of the USS Samuel B. Roberts survived his ship sinking. He spent 50 hours in the water, surrounded by sharks, watching his men die of wounds and exhaustion. He lived until 1973. He rarely spoke about the battle. When asked about the day his tiny destroyer escort charged heavy cruisers, he would simply say that they did what they had to do. There was no other choice. The Samuel B. Roberts became known as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Her namesake, a guided missile frigate, USS Samuel B. Roberts, was commissioned in 1986. That ship struck a mine in the Persian Gulf in 1988 and nearly sank. Her crew saved her. They remembered the legacy. They refused to let the name go down. The kamikazes left a different kind of legacy. The pilots who died in those attacks were mourned in Japan, celebrated as heroes who gave everything for their country. But the tactic itself died with the war. No nation has ever formally adopted suicide attacks as military doctrine since. The kamikaze strategy proved that willingness to die was not enough. The American fleet adapted. The American pilots learned to intercept. The American gunners learned to fill the sky with steel. Nearly 4,000 Japanese pilots gave their lives, and they sank 34 ships. The mathematics of sacrifice were brutal. For every ship destroyed, over 100 pilots died. Japan had traded an entire generation of young men for tactical results that couldn't change the strategic outcome. The lesson was clear. Fanaticism loses to professionalism. Courage without skill is just courage, and industrial capacity trumps individual sacrifice every time. The kamikazes killed thousands of Americans, but they never sank a fleet carrier. They never stopped an invasion. They never turned a single battle. The divine wind blew, and the American fleet sailed on. What made the difference? Why did American courage succeed where Japanese courage failed? This is the question that military historians have debated for 80 years. And the answer comes down to something simple. Systems. The American military in World War II was a learning organization. When something didn't work, they changed it. When someone had a better idea, they listened. McCampbell wasn't special because he was brave. Thousands of pilots were brave. McCampbell was special because the Navy gave him the training, the equipment, and the freedom to use his skills effectively. The Hellcat wasn't special because it was fast or powerful. Other planes were faster and more powerful. The Hellcat was special because Grumman built it to be rugged and reliable, because the Navy specified exactly what it needed, and because American factories could produce them by the thousands. The men of Taffy 3 weren't special because they were willing to die. The kamikaze pilots were willing to die too. Taffy 3 was special because American doctrine emphasized initiative at every level. Commanders like Evans and Copeland didn't wait for orders. They saw what needed to be done, and they did it. The Japanese system, by contrast, was rigid. Initiative was discouraged. Junior officers followed orders precisely because deviation meant disgrace. When Kurita retreated from Taffy 3, he did so because his communications had broken down, and he couldn't coordinate his fleet. American commanders in the same situation would have pressed the attack on their own judgment. The system mattered more than the men. The men were equally brave on both sides. The system made the difference. And here is the detail that haunts me, the twist that few people know. After the war, American intelligence officers interviewed Japanese pilots who had survived kamikaze training but never flew their final missions. They asked them what they remembered about the American pilots they had faced. One pilot, whose name has been lost to history, described watching his squadron mates die, one after another, to American Hellcats over the Philippines. He said the American pilots flew like they had all the time in the world. They were never rushed, never panicked. They would dive, fire a short burst, and climb away before anyone could respond. He said it was like being hunted by wolves who never got tired. He didn't know he was describing David McCampbell's tactics. He didn't know that one man's discipline had become the standard for an entire air force. But he knew what it felt like to face it. And 60 years later, when he was an old man in Tokyo, he still had nightmares about those blue Hellcats coming out of the sun. McCampbell's F-6F Hellcat, Mincy 3, the plane he flew on October 24, 1944. The plane that carried him through 60 to 2 odds, with 1 gallon of fuel remaining. That plane was lost. Not in combat, not in a crash. It was simply scrapped after the war, cut apart and melted down with thousands of other aircraft that were no longer needed. The Navy didn't save it. No museum preserved it. The greatest American naval aviation achievement of the war, and the aircraft that made it possible, was turned into aluminum cans and automobile parts. McCampbell never complained about that either. He understood that wars end, that equipment gets recycled, that nations move on. He had done his job. The plane was just a tool. But sometimes I wonder, what would it be worth today, that battered Hellcat with 9 kill markings on his fuselage? What would people pay to stand next to the cockpit where David McCampbell smiled at impossible odds and went hunting anyway? We'll never know. That Hellcat is gone forever. Only the story remains. So what does it all mean? Why does this story matter 80 years later? Because the men who fought over the Philippine Sea, and the men who charged Japanese battleships, and the men who faced kamikazes day after day, they weren't superheroes. They were ordinary people. Farmers and factory workers and college students who put on uniforms and learned to do extraordinary things. David McCampbell was a washed-out pilot who fought his way back in. Ernest Evans was a Cherokee from Oklahoma who told his crew they would fight aggressively and meant it. The pilots who flew with empty bomb racks over Samar were boys who had been civilians 2 years earlier. They didn't know they would become legends. They just knew what needed to be done, and they did it. That's the lesson. That's the message. That's why this story still matters. From a rejected pilot with bad eyesight to the ace of aces, from escort carriers and destroyers to a victory that should have been a massacre,
From 2 planes against 60 to a record that has never been broken. These men proved that the impossible is just a word, that odds are just numbers, that courage combined with skill and discipline can change the outcome of history. If you know another story like this, a story of ordinary people doing impossible things, share it in the comments. The history of World War II is filled with moments like this. Moments when everything depended on someone who refused to quit. Subscribe to this channel because we're going to tell more of these stories. The war produced thousands of them, and every one deserves to be remembered. In the meantime, remember this. There was a time when the sky was full of fire, and young men flew into it knowing they might not come back. Some of them became aces. Some of them became statistics. All of them were part of something larger than themselves. David McCampbell died in his bed at 86 years old. He never bragged. He never sought fame. But when the moment came, when 60 enemy aircraft filled the sky and everyone else said, "Run," he smiled and flew toward them. That's what legends are made of. Not the medals they receive, not the records they set, but the choice they make when the whole world tells them it's impossible. They choose to try anyway. And sometimes, against all odds, they win.